Sometimes the most ordinary moments become the most extraordinary. Sometimes a simple act of kindness reveals horrors that shake you to your core. Sometimes saving one person means confronting the darkest corners of human nature. What started as a routine morning ride across his ranch would become the day that changed everything, not just for him, but for a young woman whose desperate whisper would haunt his dreams forever. In a world where evil often hides behind closed doors, one man's decision to investigate a strange sound in his barn would expose a nightmare that had been unfolding right under his nose. This is the story of courage found in unexpected places, of how one person's bravery can illuminate the darkness, and how sometimes the greatest heroes are those who simply refuse to look away when others would rather not see. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Montana ranch like a soft gray blanket, slowly lifting as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy of pine trees. Jack Morrison had been working this land for 37 years, and he still found peace in these quiet morning hours before the world fully awakened. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered grass as he made his way toward the main barn, coffee mug in hand, breathing in the crisp October air that carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. At 52, Jack was a man carved by the land he worked. His weathered hands told stories of countless seasons spent mending fences, birthing calves, and battling the elements. His wife Sarah often joked that he was more comfortable with his cattle than with people, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Jack preferred the honest simplicity of ranch life to the complications of the modern world that seemed to grow more chaotic with each passing year. The Morrison Ranch stretched across 800 acres of some of the most beautiful country in southwestern Montana. It had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather, who had first claimed the land in the 1940s. Jack had no intention of being the generation that lost it. Every sunrise brought new challenges, but also the deep satisfaction that came from working the land that had shaped his family's legacy. As he approached the barn, Jack noticed something immediately wrong. The large sliding door, which he always secured with a heavy padlock each evening, stood slightly ajar. His first thought was that one of his ranch hands, Miguel or Tommy, might have come in early to tend to the horses, but neither of their trucks was in the usual parking area near the bunkhouse. A cold knot formed in his stomach as he considered the possibility of thieves. Ranch equipment was expensive, and isolated properties like his were sometimes targeted by criminals who knew the nearest neighbor was miles away. Jack set his coffee mug on a fence post and approached the barn cautiously. He wished he had brought his rifle, but it was locked in the gun safe back at the house. The only sound was the gentle lowing of cattle in the distant pasture and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees that bordered the property. He placed his hand on the barn door and slowly pushed it open, wincing as the old hinges creaked loudly in the morning quiet. The interior of the barn was dimly lit, with shafts of golden sunlight streaming through the spaces between the wooden planks. Jack's eyes adjusted slowly to the shadows as he stepped inside. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The tractor sat in its usual spot, the tools hung neatly on their hooks along the walls, and the hay bales were stacked exactly where he had left them the evening before. But something felt wrong. The air held a strange tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it, barely audible above the rustling of mice in the hay and the distant mooing of his cattle. It was a whimper, soft and human, and filled with despair. Jack froze, his heart beginning to pound as he strained to locate the source of the sound. For a moment he wondered if his imagination was playing tricks on him. The isolation of ranch life could sometimes make a man hear things that weren't there. But the sound came again, slightly louder this time, and definitely human. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the barn, where he stored extra feed sacks and old equipment. Jack moved slowly in that direction, his boots silent on the hay-covered floor. As he rounded a stack of feed bags, his eyes fell upon a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. A young woman lay on the floor, partially hidden behind the bags of grain. At first glance, Jack thought she might be dead. Her skin was pale as milk, almost translucent in the dim light. Her dark hair was matted and dirty, and her clothes were torn and stained. But as he knelt beside her, he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest and hear the soft whisper of her breathing. Her hands were bound behind her back with thick rope that had cut deep grooves into her wrists. Similar rope bound her ankles, and a dirty cloth had been tied around her mouth as a gag. Her eyes were closed, but as Jack's shadow fell across her face, they flooded open. They were green eyes, the color of spring grass, but filled with a terror so deep it made Jack's stomach clench. When she saw him, those eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. She tried to speak through the gag, but only muffled sounds emerged. Jack could see her trying to assess whether he was friend or foe, whether this stranger kneeling beside her represented salvation or further torment. The realization hit him like a physical blow, that someone had deliberately placed this woman in his barn, had left her here to suffer or die. "Save me," she whispered when he gently removed the gag from her mouth. Her voice was hoarse and barely audible, but the words cut through Jack like a knife. "Please save me." Jack's hands trembled as he reached for the rope around her wrists. He had seen plenty of suffering in his life. He had watched animals die, had lost friends in farm accidents, had even served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to claim his inheritance. But nothing had prepared him for the raw desperation in this young woman's voice or the haunted look in her eyes. As he began to work at the knots, trying to be gentle despite his urgency, Jack's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? How had she come to be in his barn? Who had done this to her? And were they still nearby? The ropes were tight and complex, clearly tied by someone who knew what they were doing. The realization that this was no random crime sent ice water through his veins. But as Jack worked to free her wrists, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The rope around her wrists wasn't just any rope. It was the same type of yellow nylon rope he used around the ranch, the same rope he kept stored in this very barn. Someone had used his own supplies to bind this woman. Someone who had access to his property, who knew where he kept his equipment. The woman's eyes never left his face as he worked. She seemed afraid to blink, as if he might disappear if she looked away for even a moment. Jack could see that she was young, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of a life far removed from the harsh realities of ranch work. Her hands, when he finally freed them, were soft and uncalloused, the hands of someone who had never known manual labor. "What's your name?" Jack asked softly, as he moved to untie her ankles. "Emma," she whispered, her voice gaining slightly more strength. "Emma Rodriguez. I'm from Denver. I was camping with friends near Glacier National Park when—" Her voice trailed off, and Jack could see her struggling to piece together fragmented memories. "When what happened, Emma?" Jack asked gently, though part of him dreaded the answer. "We were at a campsite, and there were these men. They came at night. My friends and I, we tried to run, but they were waiting for us. They had guns." Emma's voice broke, and tears began streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "They separated us. I don't know what happened to my friends. I don't know if they're alive." Jack felt rage building in his chest, anger so pure and hot it surprised him with its intensity. In all his years of living on this isolated ranch, he had always felt safe, had always believed that the worst evils of the world couldn't touch his peaceful corner of Montana. The discovery of Emma in his barn shattered that illusion completely. "How long have you been here?" he asked as he finally freed her ankles from the rope. "I don't know," Emma replied, trying to sit up with Jack's help. "Days, maybe a week. They kept moving me around different places. This is the first time I've been alone, the first time they haven't been watching me every second." "They?" Jack asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "There are 3 of them," Emma said, her voice growing stronger, now that she was free from her bonds. "The one who seems to be in charge is tall, has a scar across his left cheek. The other 2 do whatever he says. They said they were taking girls to sell to someone. They said I was worth a lot of money because I'm young and pretty." The words hit Jack like physical blows. Human trafficking. Here in his quiet corner of Montana, miles from the nearest town, criminals were using his property as a holding station for young women they planned to sell into slavery. The enormity of it was almost impossible to comprehend. "We need to get you out of here and call the police," Jack said, helping Emma to her feet. But as they moved toward the barn door, they both heard the sound that made Jack's heart stop completely. Car engines. Multiple vehicles approaching fast along the dirt road that led to his ranch. Emma's face went white with terror, and she gripped Jack's arm with surprising strength. "They're back," she whispered. "They said they would be back this morning to move me again. Oh God, they're back." Jack's mind raced as he calculated their options. The ranch house was 200 yards away, across open ground, too far to reach before the vehicles arrived. His cell phone was in the house, along with his rifle and any hope of calling for help. The barn had only one main entrance, and they could already hear the vehicles pulling up outside. "Is there another way out of here?" Emma asked desperately. But Jack shook his head. He had built this barn himself, and he knew every inch of it. There was a small window high up in the loft, but it was too small and too high to provide an escape route. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the morning air, followed by voices, male voices, speaking in low tones that carried an undercurrent of violence. Jack could make out at least 3 different voices confirming Emma's account of her captors. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered to Emma as he positioned himself between her and the barn door. He had no weapons, no way to call for help, and no clear escape route. All he had was his determination to protect this young woman who had been placed in his care by some twist of fate. The voices were getting closer, and Jack could make out snippets of conversation that chilled him to the bone. They were discussing Emma as if she were livestock, debating her value, and making crude comments about her appearance. These were not desperate men driven to crime by poverty or circumstance. These were predators who had turned human suffering into a business. Jack looked around the barn one more time, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes fell on a pitchfork hanging on the wall, its tines sharp and deadly. It wasn't much against armed men, but it was better than nothing. As he reached for the pitchfork, Emma grabbed his arm. "There's something else you need to know," she whispered urgently. "When they were moving me here, I overheard them talking. They said they knew this place. Knew the owner was gone most mornings. They said someone had been watching you, learning your routine." The implications hit Jack like a freight train. Someone had been surveilling his property, studying his habits, planning to use his isolated ranch as part of their criminal operation. The violation felt even more personal than finding Emma in his barn. These men hadn't stumbled upon his property by chance. They had deliberately targeted him, had invaded his sanctuary, and turned it into part of their nightmare. The footsteps outside were getting closer, and Jack could see shadows moving past the gaps in the barn walls. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In a matter of seconds, he and Emma would be face to face with the men who had turned a young woman into merchandise. Jack gripped the pitchfork tighter and positioned himself protectively in front of Emma. Whatever happened next, he was determined that these men would not take her again without a fight. The peaceful morning that had started with coffee and cattle had become something else entirely. Something that would test everything he believed about himself and his capacity for courage. The barn door began to slide open, and shafts of bright morning sunlight streamed across the hay-covered floor. Emma pressed closer behind Jack, and he could feel her trembling against his back. This was it. The moment that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of a young woman whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jack Morrison had lived his entire life by simple principles. Work hard, be honest, protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Now those principles would be put to the ultimate test, and failure would mean more than just his own death. It would mean abandoning Emma to a fate worse than death, a future of suffering and degradation at the hands of men who had traded their humanity for profit. As the barn door opened wider and the first figure appeared silhouetted against the morning light, Jack raised the pitchfork and prepared to fight for both their lives. The first man through the barn door was exactly as Emma had described him, tall and lean, with a jagged scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, giving his face a permanently twisted expression. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, cold and calculating as they swept the interior of the barn. He wore a black leather jacket over dark jeans, and Jack could see the bulge of a weapon beneath the jacket. Behind him came 2 other men, both shorter but built like weightlifters, their thick arms covered in tattoos that spoke of prison time and violence. One had a shaved head covered in scars, while the other sported a scraggly beard and dead eyes that seemed to look right through everything they saw. All 3 moved with the confidence of predators who were used to being the most dangerous things in any room they entered. The scarred man stopped short when he saw Jack standing protectively in front of Emma, the pitchfork gripped in his weathered hands. For a moment, surprise flickered across his features, quickly replaced by cold calculation. He had clearly expected to find Emma alone and helpless, still bound and gagged where they had left her. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Jack couldn't place. "Looks like our little prize has made a friend." His eyes never left Jack's face as he spoke, sizing him up like a predator evaluating potential prey. "My name is Victor," the man continued conversationally, as if they were meeting at a church social, rather than in a barn where he had imprisoned a young woman. "And you, old man, are somewhere you shouldn't be." Jack could feel Emma trembling behind him, could hear her quick, shallow breathing as terror threatened to overwhelm her. But he also sensed something else in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested she was gathering her courage rather than succumbing to panic. She had survived days of captivity and abuse, and she wasn't giving up now. "This is my property," Jack said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're the ones who don't belong here." Victor laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against concrete. Your property? Yes, I suppose it is. We've been watching you, old man. Every morning, you do the same thing. Coffee, check the cattle, back to the house. Predictable as sunrise. Made it very convenient for us to use your barn as a temporary storage facility. The casual way he referred to Emma as stored merchandise made Jack's grip tighten on the pitchfork. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, but the cold, businesslike approach these men took to human suffering was something beyond his experience. Let her go, Jack said simply. Take whatever you want from the ranch and leave her here. Victor's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. Oh, but she is what we want from the ranch, old man. She's worth $50,000 to the right buyer. More than all your cattle and equipment combined, I would guess. The casual mention of Emma's monetary value as if she were livestock being sold at auction sent a wave of rage through Jack that he struggled to control. He had spent his life raising cattle for slaughter, but there was a vast difference between animals bred for food and human beings stolen and sold into slavery. The girl is merchandise, Victor continued, pulling a pistol from inside his jacket with practiced ease, and you are now a complication that needs to be eliminated. The appearance of the gun changed the dynamic completely. Jack knew he could never cover the distance between himself and Victor before the man could fire. The pitchfork, that had seemed like a formidable weapon moments before, now felt inadequate against modern firearms. But Emma surprised everyone by stepping out from behind Jack's protective stance. Wait, she said, her voice stronger than it had been since Jack found her. Before you kill him, there's something you need to know. Victor's eyebrows rose slightly, his finger poised on the trigger.
And what might that be, little bird? When he found me, I told him everything. Emma lied smoothly.
About the other girls you're holding. About the warehouse in Billings where you keep them. About the man you called Dimitri who's coming to pick up the shipment tomorrow. Jack was amazed by Emma's quick thinking, but also terrified that she was provoking men who had already demonstrated their capacity for violence. He could see Victor's face darkening as she spoke, and the other 2 men were shifting restlessly, their hands moving toward their own weapons. You little! Victor started to snarl, but Emma cut him off. He already called the FBI, she continued, the lie rolling off her tongue with convincing desperation. They know about this place now. That's why he came out here alone, to stall you until they could get here. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Victor's cold eyes. Jack could see him calculating, trying to determine if Emma was telling the truth or simply trying to buy time. The morning air seemed to thicken with tension as the 3 criminals processed this new information. You're lying, Victor said finally, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Am I? Emma asked, gesturing toward the ranch house, visible through the barn door. Why do you think he's so calm? A man facing 3 armed criminals should be terrified, but look at him. He knows help is coming. Jack marveled at Emma's courage and quick thinking, but he also knew that her bluff could only work for so long. Eventually, Victor would realize that no cavalry was coming, that they were truly alone and helpless against these armed predators. The scarred man's eyes darted between Jack and Emma, his mind clearly working through the implications of what she had told him. If law enforcement was truly on the way, staying here would be suicide. But if Emma was lying, killing both witnesses, and retrieving their valuable merchandise would be the logical course of action. Carlos, Victor said to the man with the shaved head, go check the road. See if there are any vehicles approaching. Carlos nodded and jogged toward the barn door, his heavy boots echoing in the confined space. As he moved past Jack, the rancher caught a whiff of stale cigarettes and unwashed clothes that spoke of men who had been living rough for some time. While they waited for Carlos to report back, Victor kept his gun trained on Jack, but his attention was clearly divided. Emma had planted seeds of doubt that were growing in his mind, and Jack could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed their options. Even if the FBI isn't coming, Emma said quietly, you've already lost control of this operation. Too many people know now. Too many loose ends to tie up. Shut up, Victor snarled, but Emma pressed on. The smart play is to cut your losses and run, she continued. Take what you can carry and disappear. Staying here to kill us just increases your exposure. Jack was impressed by Emma's tactical thinking, but he could also see that she was walking a dangerous line. Victor was clearly a man accustomed to solving problems with violence, and pushing him too hard could provoke exactly the response they were trying to avoid. Carlos returned at a jog, shaking his head. Road's empty, he reported. No vehicles, no dust clouds, nothing. Victor's face hardened as he realized Emma had been bluffing. The brief uncertainty that had flickered in his eyes was replaced by cold resolve. "Clever little bird," he said, raising his pistol to point directly at Emma's head. But not clever enough. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched Victor's finger begin to tighten on the trigger. In that frozen moment, several things happened simultaneously. Emma dove to the side using a stack of hay bales as cover. Jack lunged forward with the pitchfork, knowing he couldn't reach Victor in time, but hoping to disrupt his aim. And from somewhere outside the barn came a sound that changed everything. The distinctive whine of approaching sirens. Victor's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening in genuine surprise for the first time since entering the barn. The sirens were still distant, but growing louder, and there was no mistaking their meaning. Law enforcement was indeed approaching the ranch, though not because of any call Jack had made. "How?" Victor started to say, then stopped as the implications sank in. Whether Emma had been telling the truth about Jack calling for help, or whether the authorities had found them through some other means, was irrelevant now. What mattered was that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "We need to go," said the man with the scraggly beard, his voice tight with panic. "Now!" But Victor seemed frozen by indecision. The sirens were definitely getting closer, but they still had time to kill both witnesses and escape if they moved quickly. On the other hand, taking the time for murder might mean the difference between escape and capture. Jack could see the internal battle playing out on Victor's scarred features. The man was clearly a career criminal, someone who had survived by making quick decisions under pressure. But the unexpected arrival of law enforcement had disrupted his calculations and introduced variables he hadn't planned for. "Victor!" the bearded man said urgently. "We have to move." The sound of his name seemed to snap Victor out of his paralysis. He lowered the gun slightly and took a step backward toward the barn door. "This isn't over," he said, his voice filled with cold promise. "We know where you live, old man. We know your routines. We'll be back." "No, you won't," Jack said with a conviction that surprised even himself, "because you're going to prison." Victor's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think a few country sheriffs are going to catch us? We've been doing this for years, across multiple states. By tonight, we'll be 200 miles from here, with new identities and a new plan." The sirens were much closer now, and Jack could make out the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed. Victor and his men could hear it too, and their body language shifted from predatory confidence to urgent retreat. "Remember what I said," Victor told Jack as he backed toward the door. "We'll be back, and next time you won't see us coming." The three men melted away through the barn door like shadows, leaving Jack and Emma alone in the hay-scented darkness. Jack could hear them running toward their vehicles, engines starting, tires spinning on gravel as they made their escape. Emma emerged from behind the hay bales, her face pale but determined. "Are you all right?" she asked Jack, which struck him as remarkably selfless given what she had just endured. "I should be asking you that question," Jack replied, setting down the pitchfork with hands that were only now beginning to shake with delayed reaction. The sirens were very close now, and through the barn door Jack could see dust clouds approaching along his access road. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, with the distinctive light patterns of law enforcement vehicles flashing through the morning air. "But how?" Emma asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at Jack since the first siren became audible. "How did they know to come here?" Jack shook his head. "I have no idea. But right now, I'm not questioning it." The first sheriff's vehicle slid to a stop outside the barn, in a cloud of dust and gravel, followed immediately by two more patrol cars and what appeared to be an FBI vehicle. Car doors slammed, and Jack could hear voices shouting instructions and coordinating their approach. "In the barn!" Jack called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "We're in the barn." Within seconds, the doorway was filled with law enforcement officers, weapons drawn but lowered when they saw Jack and Emma standing peacefully inside. A tall woman in an FBI windbreaker stepped forward, her sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Are either of you injured?" she asked, her voice professional but kind. "We're okay," Emma replied, though her voice was shaky. "But they just left. 3 men, they had guns. They went toward the main road." The FBI agent spoke quickly into her radio, coordinating the pursuit of Victor and his associates. Jack could hear the response crackle back. Roadblocks were being established, helicopters were being dispatched, and a wide dragnet was being cast across the surrounding area. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen," the woman said, turning her attention back to Jack and Emma. "We've been tracking this human trafficking ring for months. When we finally got a break in the case, one of our informants told us they were using isolated ranches as temporary holding facilities. You mean this isn't the first time they've used someone's property like this? Jack asked, appalled by the implication. Unfortunately, no, Agent Chen replied grimly. This organization has been operating across multiple western states, using rural properties as way stations while they transport victims to major cities for sale. You're lucky we got here when we did. Emma sank down onto a hay bale, the full impact of her situation finally hitting her. My friends, she said, her voice breaking. They took my friends too. Are they still alive? Agent Chen's expression softened. We're going to do everything we can to find them, she promised. Your escape and the information you can provide might be exactly what we need to break this case wide open. Over the next hour, the ranch was transformed into a crime scene. Evidence technicians photographed everything, collected the ropes that had bound Emma, and dusted for fingerprints. Other agents interviewed both Jack and Emma separately, building a comprehensive picture of what had transpired. Jack learned that the FBI had been closing in on Victor's organization for months, following a trail of missing persons reports and human trafficking cases across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Emma and her friends had been just the latest victims in a pipeline that had destroyed dozens of lives. The good news, Agent Chen told Jack as the afternoon sun began to slant through the barn windows, is that your quick thinking and bravery have given us our best lead yet. The bad news is that Victor wasn't lying when he said they know where you live. Until we can apprehend all members of this organization, you could be in danger. The weight of Victor's threat settled on Jack's shoulders like a physical burden. His peaceful ranch, his sanctuary from the complications of the modern world, had been violated in the worst possible way. Even when the criminals were caught, he would never again feel the same sense of security that had defined his life for 37 years. But as he watched Emma giving her statement to another agent, describing her ordeal with a courage that amazed him, Jack realized that some things were worth the risk. Sometimes ordinary people were called upon to do extraordinary things, not because they sought adventure or heroism, but because circumstances demanded it. The battle was far from over. Victor and his men were still free, still dangerous, and still committed to their profitable trade in human misery. The organization they represented was larger than just 3 men, and breaking it completely would require time, resources, and the kind of determination that only came from seeing evil face to face. As the sun began to set over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack Morrison stood in his barn and contemplated how much his life had changed in a single day. The peaceful routine that had defined his existence was gone forever, replaced by the knowledge that evil could appear anywhere, even in the most unlikely places. But he had also learned something about himself that day. When faced with the choice between personal safety and protecting an innocent victim, he had chosen courage over cowardice, action over inaction. It was a choice he would have to make again before this ordeal was over. The safe house was a modest 2-story home on the outskirts of Helena, Montana, unremarkable in every way except for the subtle modifications that marked it as a government facility. Reinforced windows, security cameras disguised as ordinary fixtures, and an electronic lock system that required both a keycard and biometric scan to operate. Jack had never imagined he would find himself in such a place, much less living there under federal protection. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that changed everything. 3 weeks since Agent Chen had explained that Victor and his associates had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only false identities and cold trails that led nowhere. The FBI's investigation had expanded dramatically, revealing a network of human trafficking that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of criminals working in coordinated cells. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The haunted look in her green eyes had softened somewhat since that first terrible morning, but Jack could see that the trauma ran deep. She had regained some weight, and the physical injuries had healed, but the psychological wounds would take much longer to mend. "Any word about your friends?" Jack asked gently, settling into the chair across from her with his own coffee. Emma shook her head, fresh tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "Agent Chen says they're still investigating, but it's been 3 weeks. If Sarah and Michelle were alive, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that had been eating at her since the day they were separated at the campsite." Jack reached across the table and covered her hand with his own weathered one. In the weeks they had spent in protective custody together, an unlikely bond had formed between the grizzled rancher and the young woman he had saved. She reminded him of his daughter Kelly, who lived in Seattle with her family and visited the ranch only twice a year. Emma, in turn, had found in Jack a father figure whose steady presence helped anchor her in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and dangerous. "Don't give up hope," Jack said, though he privately shared her fears. He had seen enough of life to know that bad things happen to good people. and that sometimes hope was all that stood between despair and the will to keep fighting. Agent Chen had visited them twice a week since they had been placed in protective custody, updating them on the progress of the investigation and ensuring their safety. The updates had been frustrating in their lack of concrete progress. Victor's organization had proven to be more sophisticated and well-funded than initially suspected, with resources and connections that allowed them to disappear completely when things got too dangerous. The door chimed softly, indicating that someone with authorized access was entering the safe house. A moment later, Agent Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days, and her normally immaculate suit was wrinkled and coffee-stained. "I have news," she announced without preamble, settling into a chair at the table. "Some good, some not so good." Emma straightened in her chair, hope and fear warring in her expression. "Did you find them? Did you find Sarah and Michelle?" Agent Chen's hesitation answered the question before she spoke. "We found evidence that they were moved through a facility in Billings just as you described. But by the time we raided the location, it had been abandoned for at least 2 weeks. We're still following leads, but they could be anywhere by now," Emma finished, her voice hollow with resignation. "We're not giving up," Agent Chen said firmly. "But I need to prepare you for the possibility that this could take months or even years to fully resolve. These organizations are designed to be compartmentalized, so that if one cell is compromised, the others can continue operating." Jack felt a familiar anger building in his chest. 3 weeks of living in limbo, 3 weeks of watching Emma struggle with guilt and fear. And the authorities were no closer to catching the men responsible. "What about Victor and his crew? Any leads there?" Agent Chen's expression darkened. "That's the not-so-good news. We have reason to believe they're still in the area." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He had assumed that the criminals would have fled to another state by now, that they would want to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the failed operation at his ranch. "What kind of reason?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Agent Chen pulled a tablet from her briefcase and set it on the table between them. The screen showed a grainy security camera image of 3 men entering what appeared to be a truck stop. Even with the poor image quality, the tall figure with the scarred face was unmistakably Victor. "This was taken yesterday morning at a gas station about 40 miles from your ranch," Agent Chen explained. "They're not trying to disappear anymore. They're actively hunting for you." The implications sent ice water through Jack's veins. Victor had meant it when he said he would be back. The safe house that had felt like a temporary inconvenience suddenly seemed like the only thing standing between them and violent retribution. "Why would they stay?" Jack asked. "It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. They've lost their operation here. Their holding facility has been compromised. Why not just move on to easier targets?" Agent Chen's expression suggested she had been asking herself the same question. "We think it's become personal for Victor. Our psychological profile indicates he's someone who doesn't tolerate being outmaneuvered or humiliated. The fact that a rancher and a captive managed to disrupt his operation may have triggered a need for revenge that overrides his business judgment." Emma shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to ward off a physical chill. "So we're stuck here indefinitely? We can't go home, can't resume our lives, because some psychopath can't accept that his evil scheme failed. We're working on a solution," Agent Chen said, but her tone suggested that solution was neither simple nor imminent. "The problem is that Victor's organization has resources we're still trying to fully understand. They have financial backing, sophisticated communication systems, and contacts that allow them to stay one step ahead of law enforcement." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the implications. He thought about his ranch, sitting empty except for the neighbor, who was feeding his cattle twice a day. He thought about the life he had built over 37 years, now disrupted by circumstances beyond his control. "There has to be another way," he said finally. "We can't just hide forever." Agent Chen studied him carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back." Jack's voice carried the same quiet determination that had sustained him through 2 tours in Vietnam and decades of ranch work. "These men are criminals, not soldiers. They're used to preying on helpless victims, not facing organized resistance." "Absolutely not," Agent Chen said immediately. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your frustration, but what you're suggesting is essentially vigilantism. We cannot and will not use civilians as bait in a federal investigation." "Even if those civilians volunteer?" Emma asked quietly. Both Jack and Agent Chen turned to look at her in surprise. The young woman who had been struggling with trauma and despair suddenly showed flashes of the inner strength that had allowed her to survive captivity and think quickly under pressure. Emma, you don't understand what you're saying, Agent Chen protested. These men are extremely dangerous. They've already demonstrated their willingness to kill witnesses. And that's exactly why we can't spend the rest of our lives hiding from them, Emma replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. They've already destroyed so much. My friends are gone, maybe dead. Mr. Spa, Morrison's life has been turned upside down. How many other lives will they ruin while we sit here drinking coffee and waiting for them to disappear? Jack felt a surge of admiration for the young woman's courage, but also concern for what she was suggesting. Emma, Agent Chen is right. These aren't men you can negotiate with or reason with. If we try to draw them out, people are going to get hurt. People are already getting hurt, Emma shot back. Right now, somewhere, they probably have other girls like Sarah and Michelle. Every day we wait is another day those girls suffer. Agent Chen rubbed her temples as if fighting off a headache. Even if I were willing to consider such an operation, which I'm not, we don't have the resources for the kind of elaborate sting you're imagining. My task force is already stretched thin across multiple states. What if it didn't require elaborate resources? Jack asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What if we just gave them what they want? Which is? Agent Chen asked warily. Revenge? Jack said simply. Victor wants to settle the score with the rancher and the girl who embarrassed him. So let's give him the opportunity, but on our terms instead of his. Emma leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest despite the danger inherent in what Jack was suggesting. You mean go back to the ranch? I mean return to our normal lives, but with backup ready and waiting. Jack clarified. Victor and his men are professionals when it comes to human trafficking, but they're not trained soldiers or law enforcement officers. They're used to dealing with helpless victims, not prepared targets. Agent Chen was shaking her head before Jack finished speaking. The liability alone would be career-ending for me. If either of you were injured or killed in such an operation, the Bureau would crucify me. But if it worked, Emma said, if we could draw them out and capture them, how many lives would we save? How many other potential victims would never have to go through what I went through? The kitchen fell silent as each of them contemplated the moral complexity of the situation. Jack understood Agent Chen's position, but he also understood Emma's frustration with their passive role in the investigation. Somewhere out there, Victor and his associates were free to continue their trade in human misery while their victims hid in safe houses, and their families wondered if they would ever come home. Agent Chen's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen before answering. Chen here. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. When? How many? I understand. I'll be there in an hour. She ended the call and set the phone down with hands that trembled slightly. That was the field office in Denver. They found the remains of 2 young women in a shallow grave about 60 miles south of the city. Emma's face went white, and Jack felt his stomach clench with dread. Sarah and Michelle? Emma whispered. We don't know yet, Agent Chen replied gently. But the physical description and estimated time of death are consistent. We should have dental records confirmation within 24 hours. The news hit Emma like a physical blow, and she doubled over in her chair as if she had been punched in the stomach. Jack immediately moved to comfort her, but there was nothing he could say that would ease the pain of losing her best friends to such senseless violence. I'm sorry, Agent Chen said, her professional composure cracking slightly. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. How many more? Emma asked through her tears. How many more girls are going to die while we sit here and wait for the perfect moment to act? Agent Chen had no answer, because there was no good answer. The investigation was proceeding as quickly and thoroughly as possible, but criminal organizations like Victor's were designed to be resilient. Cutting off one head often only revealed that 2 more had grown in its place. I want to do it, Emma said suddenly, raising her head to look directly at Agent Chen. Whatever Mr. Morrison is proposing, I want to do it. I want to be the bait that draws these monsters out. Emma, you're in shock, Jack said gently. This isn't the time to make decisions about risking your life. This is exactly the time, Emma replied with fierce determination. When will there be a better time? When they've killed 10 more girls? 20? When does our safety become less important than stopping them from destroying other lives? Agent Chen stood up from the table, her internal conflict visible on her face. She was caught between her duty to protect federal witnesses and her responsibility to the victims of an ongoing criminal enterprise. The decision she made in the next few minutes could determine not only the fate of Jack and Emma, but the future of the FBI's entire investigation into the trafficking network. If we were to consider such an operation, she said slowly, it would have to be completely voluntary on both your parts. You would both have to sign extensive waivers acknowledging the risks, and it would have to be planned and executed with extreme precision. Jack felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect of actively fighting back against the men who had violated his sanctuary and destroyed so many lives. But he also understood that once they committed to this path, there would be no turning back. Victor would accept nothing less than their deaths, and failure would mean not just their own destruction, but the continued operation of a criminal network that fed on human suffering.
What would it involve? Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks.
Agent Chen began pacing the small kitchen, her mind already working through the logistical challenges of such an operation. We would have to make it appear that you had both returned to your normal routines. Jack would go back to his ranch, Emma would need to establish a presence somewhere Victor's people could track her, then we would have to wait for them to make their move. How long might that take? Jack asked. Days, weeks, possibly months, Agent Chen replied. These men are patient when they need to be. They might watch for weeks before they feel confident enough to strike. The prospect of living for months under the constant threat of attack was daunting, but Jack had spent 2 years in Vietnam under similar circumstances. The difference was that this time, he would be protecting someone rather than simply trying to survive. There's something else to consider, Agent Chen continued. If we do this, if we use you as bait to draw out Victor's organization, it has to work. We'll only get one chance. If they suspect it's a trap, they'll disappear completely and resurface somewhere else, probably in another state where we'll have to start the investigation from scratch. Emma wiped her eyes and stood up from the table, her posture straightening with resolve. Then we'd better make sure it works, she said. Because I'm tired of being a victim, and I'm tired of watching other people become victims while I hide in a safe house. Jack looked at this young woman who had endured horrors that would have broken many people, yet was now volunteering to risk her life to save others. He thought about his quiet ranch, his peaceful routine, and the life he had built in isolation from the world's problems. All of that was gone now, destroyed by men who traded in human misery for profit. But perhaps something better could be built from the ashes. Perhaps two unlikely allies could strike a blow against evil that would resonate far beyond their own personal struggle for justice and survival. Count me in, Jack said, meeting Agent Chen's eyes with steady determination. But we do this right. We plan it carefully, we stack the odds in our favor, and we make sure that when Victor comes for us, he walks into a trap instead of finding easy victims. Agent Chen stopped pacing and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet suburban street that had become their temporary prison. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were planning violence while innocent people went about their daily lives, unaware of the predators in their midst. All right, she said finally, turning back to face Jack and Emma. But we do this my way, with my rules, and with enough backup to ensure that if something goes wrong, you both survive to testify against these bastards. The die was cast. The hiding was over. Now came the most dangerous part of their journey, the part where they would discover whether courage and careful planning could triumph over evil and violence. The stakes could not have been higher, and failure was not an option. The Morrison Ranch looked exactly as it had 2 months earlier, but Jack could feel the difference in every breath of crisp November air. Hidden cameras monitored every approach to the property. FBI agents were stationed in concealed positions throughout the surrounding hills. His barn, the site of his first encounter with Emma and her captors, now contained sophisticated listening devices and motion sensors that would alert law enforcement the moment anyone entered. Jack sat on his front porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the sun set behind the pine trees. To any observer, he appeared to be a man simply enjoying the peaceful end of another day on his ranch. But beneath his calm exterior, every nerve was on edge. Victor and his associates had been spotted twice in the past week, each time closer to the ranch, clearly conducting reconnaissance for their planned revenge. Emma was 40 miles away in Bozeman, living in a small apartment under the identity of Sarah Walsh, a graduate student at Montana State University. The cover story was that she was Jack's niece, staying in town while conducting research for her thesis. It was close enough to the ranch that Victor's people could easily find her, but far enough away that law enforcement would have time to respond if things went wrong. Agent Chen had insisted on keeping them separated, reasoning that if Victor's group tried to take both targets simultaneously, it would divide their resources and give the FBI tactical advantages. Jack understood the logic, but he missed Emma's steady presence and quiet courage. In the weeks they had spent in protective custody together, she had become like family to him. His secure phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Agent Chen. Package spotted at location 3. Estimate 6 hours until delivery. The coded message meant that Victor's team had been seen at a gas station 6 miles from the ranch, and surveillance suggested they would make their move after midnight when the cover of darkness would give them the advantage they sought. Jack typed back a simple "understood" and set the phone aside. 6 hours to wait. 6 hours to contemplate all the ways their carefully laid plan could go wrong. He had faced danger before, but never while knowing that someone else's life depended on his performance. If he made a mistake tonight, Emma could pay the price along with him. The FBI had briefed him extensively on what to expect. Victor's group would likely approach the ranch house first, assuming that Jack would be sleeping and vulnerable. They had studied his routines for weeks before their first attempt to use his barn, so they would know that he typically went to bed around 10 o'clock and rose before dawn. What they wouldn't know was that the house was now equipped with every security measure the FBI could deploy. Motion sensors would detect their approach long before they reached the building. Infrared cameras would track their movements even in complete darkness, and most importantly, a rapid response team was stationed less than 2 miles away, ready to move the moment Jack gave the signal or his panic button was activated. But the plan required Jack to appear completely normal until the very last moment. He needed to let Victor's people get close enough to commit to their attack before springing the trap. If they suspected an ambush too early, they would simply disappear into the night and try again another time, possibly when the FBI wasn't ready for them. Jack went inside as darkness fell, following his normal routine with mechanical precision. He prepared a simple dinner, watched the news on television, and made a show of securing the house for the night. Anyone watching through binoculars would see exactly what they expected: an old rancher going through the motions of his solitary evening routine. But his rifle was loaded and ready beside his bed, along with body armor the FBI had provided. Emergency beacons were positioned throughout the house, each one capable of summoning immediate tactical support. And most importantly, he wore a wire that would broadcast every word to the command post where Agent Chen was coordinating the operation. At 10:30, Jack turned off the lights and went through the motions of preparing for bed. But instead of sleeping, he lay fully dressed under the covers, his hand resting on the panic button that would flood the ranch with federal agents in less than 3 minutes. The waiting was the hardest part, harder than the actual combat he had experienced in Vietnam. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in Bozeman, Emma was playing her own dangerous role in their elaborate deception. She had spent the evening at the university library, making sure to be seen by multiple witnesses who could later testify that she had been following her normal routine. Her apartment was under surveillance, but it had to appear that she was living her life without any awareness of the danger closing in. Agent Chen had warned her that Victor's group might try to take her first, using her as leverage against Jack, or they might attempt to grab both targets simultaneously, dividing their forces but potentially overwhelming law enforcement's ability to respond effectively. The uncertainty was agonizing, but Emma had insisted on playing her part despite the risks. Her phone buzzed at 11:15 with a text that appeared to be from a classmate asking about a study group, but the coded message actually informed her that suspicious vehicles had been spotted near her apartment building. Emma's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to respond normally, typing back about meeting in the library the next day while her hands trembled with adrenaline. Back at the ranch, Jack heard the first sounds that indicated the waiting was over. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, barely audible even in the complete silence of the Montana night. Multiple sets of footsteps moving with the practiced stealth of men who had done this many times before. They were approaching from the east, using a dry creek bed for concealment, just as the FBI had predicted they would. Jack's earpiece crackled with the voice of the tactical commander positioned in the hills. Alpha Team, we have visual contact with 3 individuals approaching the primary structure. All units maintain position until the signal is given. Victor and his associates were being allowed to get dangerously close to the house before law enforcement would reveal itself. The plan required them to actually attempt their attack, to commit crimes that would justify the massive federal response that was waiting to be unleashed. Through his bedroom window, Jack caught a glimpse of movement near his barn. A tall figure that could only be Victor was directing his companions to flank the house, just as tactical experts had predicted. These men were following a playbook they had used successfully before, but this time their intended victims were ready and waiting. Jack keyed his microphone twice, the signal that he had visual contact with the targets. From his position, he could see all three men now, moving with military precision toward different entrances to his house. They were armed and clearly prepared for violence, but they had no idea they were walking into the most sophisticated trap the FBI had ever set for a human trafficking organization. The first breach came at the kitchen door, where the man with the scraggly beard used some kind of electronic device to defeat the lock. Jack could hear him moving through the lower level of the house, his footsteps muffled but still audible to someone who knew every creak and groan of the old wooden floors. Victor himself approached the front door, while the third man, Carlos with the shaved head, positioned himself near the back of the house to cut off any escape routes. They were following the same pattern they had probably used dozens of times before, surrounding their target and then closing in for the kill. But this time, their target was neither sleeping nor helpless. Jack lay in his bed with his rifle ready, body armor protecting his vital organs, and the full weight of the federal government prepared to come to his aid. All he had to do was stay alive long enough for the trap to close. The basement door opened with a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Someone was climbing the stairs toward the main level of the house, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise. Jack could track their progress by the subtle sounds that would have been inaudible to anyone less familiar with the house. His earpiece whispered with updates from the surveillance team. Target 1 has entered through the kitchen entrance. Target 2 is at the front door. Target 3 remains in overwatch position near the barn. Victor was taking his time with the front door, probably using the same electronic device his companion had employed at the kitchen entrance. These men had invested in sophisticated equipment, another indication that their criminal organization was well-funded and professionally organized. The plan called for Jack to let them get inside the house before triggering the response. The FBI wanted them caught in the act of attempted murder, with no possible legal defense or claim of misunderstanding. But lying in his bed while armed killers invaded his home required a level of nerve that even Vietnam had not prepared him for. The kitchen door opened, and Jack could hear careful footsteps moving through his living room. Whoever had entered was searching systematically, probably looking for the stairs that led to the bedroom level. They would find them soon enough, and then the final phase of the deadly game would begin. Victor finally defeated the front door lock, and Jack heard the distinctive squeak of hinges that he had been meaning to oil for months. Now he could track two different sets of footsteps moving through his house, converging on the staircase that led to where he waited. His finger hovered over the panic button, ready to flood the ranch with tactical agents the moment the shooting started. But the plan required him to wait until the absolute last possible moment to let Victor's people commit themselves completely before revealing that they had walked into an ambush. The first footstep on the staircase sent Jack's adrenaline into overdrive. Someone was climbing toward his bedroom, probably Victor himself coming to settle their personal score face-to-face. The second set of footsteps remained on the main level, probably guarding the exits to ensure their target couldn't escape. Through his earpiece, Jack heard Agent Chen's voice, tight with tension but professionally calm. All units prepare for breach on my command. Snipers have clear shots on target 3. Assault teams are in position. The footsteps on the stairs were halfway to the top now, moving with the confidence of a predator who believed his prey was helpless and unaware. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle, knowing that in less than a minute he would either be dead or facing the man who had terrorized Emma and countless other innocent victims. Victor's voice drifted up the staircase, barely above a whisper, but clearly audible in the profound silence. Time to settle our account, old man. The bedroom door began to open slowly, revealing a sliver of hallway darkness beyond. Jack could see the barrel of a pistol preceding its owner into the room, followed by Victor's scarred face twisted with anticipation of revenge. For a frozen moment, the two men stared at each other across the darkened bedroom. Victor clearly hadn't expected to find his target awake and armed, while Jack was struck by how ordinary evil could look when stripped of its intimidating mystique. Surprise, Jack said quietly, and pressed the panic button that would change everything. The ranch exploded into chaos as floodlights illuminated the entire property and tactical agents emerged from concealment throughout the surrounding hills. Victor's eyes widened with shock and rage as he realized he had been outmaneuvered, that his carefully planned revenge had become his own destruction. FBI, drop your weapons. The shouts came from multiple directions as armed agents swarmed the house and surrounding grounds. Victor raised his pistol toward Jack, murder still blazing in his eyes despite the hopelessness of his situation. But before he could fire, Jack's rifle spoke first, and the man who had built a criminal empire on human suffering collapsed to the bedroom floor. Simultaneously, agents breached every entrance to the house, overwhelming the other two criminals before they could mount any effective resistance. Carlos was taken alive near the barn, while the bearded man surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming force. Within minutes, the ranch was secure, and Agent Chen was standing in Jack's bedroom surveying the scene with professional satisfaction. "Nice shooting," she said, noting that Jack's single rifle shot had ended Victor's threat without killing him. "Clean and surgical."
The most dangerous phase of their elaborate trap had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes.
But Jack knew that the real victory wouldn't be complete until Emma was safely accounted for and the rest of Victor's criminal network had been dismantled. As if reading his thoughts, Agent Chen's radio crackled with an update from Bozeman. "Package 2 is secure, no hostile contact at secondary location." Emma was safe. The trap had worked perfectly, capturing the leaders of a human trafficking ring while protecting the innocent people they had targeted for revenge. But as Jack looked down at Victor's unconscious form bleeding on his bedroom floor, he knew that justice was still incomplete. Somewhere out there, other members of this criminal organization were still operating. Other victims were still suffering. The battle they had won tonight was significant, but the war against human trafficking was far from over. The rancher who had wanted nothing more than peace and solitude had become a soldier in that war, whether he liked it or not. And tomorrow would bring new challenges in the fight to dismantle an evil that fed on human suffering and thrived in the shadows of civilization. 6 months later, Jack Morrison stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana, his weathered hands resting calmly on the polished wood rail as he faced the jury for the final time. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of trafficking victims from across multiple states. The trial of Viktor Kozlov and his criminal organization had become a landmark case in the fight against human trafficking. Viktor sat at the defendant's table, his scarred face impassive as he listened to Jack's testimony through a court interpreter. The bullet wound Jack had inflicted during their final confrontation had left Viktor with a permanent limp and a constant reminder of the night his criminal empire began to crumble. His two surviving associates had already pleaded guilty in exchange for cooperation against their former boss and his broader network. "Mr. Morrison," the federal prosecutor said, "can you tell the jury what you saw when you first discovered Emma Rodriguez in your barn that morning?" Jack had told this story dozens of times to investigators, prosecutors, and grand juries, but it never got easier. The memory of Emma's terrified whisper, "Save me," still haunted his dreams. 6 months later, he recounted the events with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the investigation, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was describing. Emma sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, her presence a source of strength for Jack during the difficult days of testimony. She had recovered remarkably well from her ordeal, though Jack knew the psychological scars would take years to fully heal. She had returned to college in Denver, where she was studying criminal justice with the intention of joining the FBI and continuing the fight against human trafficking. Agent Chen had told Jack that Emma's case had become a turning point in federal efforts to combat trafficking networks. Her survival and testimony had provided investigators with unprecedented insight into how these organizations operated, leading to arrests and convictions across 6 states. More than 40 victims had been rescued as a direct result of the intelligence gathered during Victor's investigation. But the victory had come at a cost that weighed heavily on Jack's conscience. Emma's friends, Sarah and Michelle, had been found dead, their bodies recovered from shallow graves in 3 different states. They had become casualties in a war they never knew they were fighting. Innocent young women whose only crime had been camping in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecutor continued his methodical questioning, building a comprehensive picture of Victor's criminal enterprise for the jury. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions of dollars in trafficking profits. Testimony from dozens of rescued victims. Physical evidence linking Victor's organization to crimes spanning multiple years and multiple states. Jack's role in the investigation had made him something of a reluctant celebrity. News outlets had dubbed him the rancher who fought back, and he had received hundreds of letters from people around the country praising his courage. But Jack took no satisfaction in the attention. He had simply done what any decent person would do when confronted with evil, and he was uncomfortable with being portrayed as a hero. The defense attorney, an expensive lawyer from Chicago who specialized in organized crime cases, attempted to portray Victor as a small-time criminal who had been unfairly targeted by an overzealous federal investigation. But the mountain of evidence against him made such arguments seem desperate and unconvincing. After 3 hours of testimony, Jack was finally dismissed from the witness stand. As he walked past the defendant's table, Victor's cold eyes tracked his movement with undisguised hatred. Even facing life in prison, the man showed no remorse for the suffering he had caused, no recognition that his victims were human beings rather than merchandise. Emma was waiting for him in the hallway outside the courtroom, her smile warm with gratitude and affection. "You did great in there," she said, giving him a hug that reminded Jack of embraces from his own daughter. "Just telling the truth," Jack replied, uncomfortable as always with praise for doing what he considered his simple duty. Agent Chen approached them, her usually serious expression softened by what might have been satisfaction. "The jury began deliberating an hour ago," she reported. "Based on the evidence and witness testimony, I'd say Victor will be spending the rest of his life in federal prison." The trial had been the culmination of months of investigation that had dismantled one of the largest human trafficking networks operating in the western United States. But Jack knew that the criminal organization had been just one part of a much larger problem. Even with Victor behind bars, other predators were already moving to fill the vacuum left by his arrest. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "I mean, after the verdict?" "Now we keep fighting," Agent Chen said simply. Victor's network was significant, but it wasn't unique. There are dozens of similar organizations operating across the country, and they're all learning from what happened to Victor. They'll adapt, become more careful, harder to track. Jack nodded grimly. In the months since the confrontation at his ranch, he had learned more about human trafficking than he had ever wanted to know. The scope of the problem was staggering, with hundreds of thousands of victims worldwide and billions of dollars in profits for the criminals who exploited them. But he had also learned that ordinary people could make a difference. Emma's rescue had been just the beginning of a chain reaction that had saved dozens of other victims and dismantled a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not by soldiers or police officers, but by regular citizens who simply refused to look away when they encountered evil. The jury returned with their verdict after only 4 hours of deliberation. Victor Kozlov was found guilty on all charges, including human trafficking, conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again be able to harm innocent victims. As the gavel fell and Victor was led away in shackles, Jack felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete. Victor's conviction wouldn't bring back Sarah and Michelle, wouldn't erase the trauma experienced by Emma and countless other victims, wouldn't prevent other criminals from taking Victor's place in the lucrative trafficking trade. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Jack and Emma, shouting questions about their experiences and their plans for the future. Jack endured the attention with his usual stoic grace, but Emma surprised everyone by stepping forward to address the media directly. "Victor Kozlov was just one man," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the cameras and microphones thrust in her direction. "His conviction is important, but it's not the end of the story. There are still victims out there who need our help, and there are still criminals who think they can profit from human suffering." A reporter called out, "What would you say to other trafficking victims who might be watching this?" Emma paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the worst that evil could offer. "I would tell them that they're not alone, that there are people fighting for them even when they can't fight for themselves. And I would tell them that survival is just the first step. The real victory comes when we use our experiences to protect others from going through what we went through." Jack watched Emma field the reporter's questions with remarkable poise and maturity, marveling at how much she had grown since that terrible morning in his barn. The frightened young woman who had whispered, "Save me," had become a powerful advocate for victims' rights and a tireless fighter against human trafficking. After the media attention died down, Jack and Emma found themselves alone on the courthouse steps as the sun began to set over the Montana mountains. The past 6 months had changed both of their lives in fundamental ways, forging an unlikely bond between a solitary rancher and a college student from the city. "What will you do now?" Emma asked. "Will you go back to the ranch?" Jack nodded, though he knew that his quiet life was forever changed. "The cattle still need tending, and the land needs working, but I think I might also help Agent Chen with her task force when she needs someone who understands how these criminals think." "I'm glad," Emma said. "The world needs more people like you, people who are willing to stand up and fight when it matters." They walked together towards Jack's pickup truck, their conversation turning to lighter topics as the weight of the trial began to lift from their shoulders. Emma would be returning to Denver in the morning to resume her studies, while Jack would drive back to his ranch and the life he was rebuilding from the ashes of his former solitude. But their partnership in the fight against human trafficking was far from over. Agent Chen had offered both of them consulting positions with the FBI task force, roles that would allow them to help train other agents and work with other victims. It was dangerous work, but it was also meaningful in a way that went far beyond personal satisfaction. As they reached Jack's truck, Emma turned to face him one last time. "You know, that morning in the barn, when I asked you to save me, I thought I was just asking you to cut some ropes and call the police. What do you think you were asking for now?" Jack inquired gently. Emma smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, the expression reached all the way to her eyes. "I think I was asking you to help me save myself," she said, "and everyone else who might need saving." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The rescue in the barn had been just the beginning. The real salvation had come through fighting back, through refusing to be victims, through turning their ordeal into something that could protect others from similar suffering. They drove away from the courthouse as darkness fell over Helena, two unlikely allies who had discovered that ordinary courage could triumph over extraordinary evil. Behind them, the wheels of justice continued to turn as investigators followed leads generated by Victor's trial, tracking down other members of his network and building cases against trafficking organizations in other states. The war against human trafficking was far from over, but Victor's conviction had struck a significant blow against those who would exploit the innocent for profit. And somewhere in the darkness, other victims who might never know Jack Morrison's name would be safer because one rancher had refused to look away when evil invaded his quiet corner of the world. Jack returned to his ranch that night, but it was no longer the isolated sanctuary it had once been. It was now part of a larger community of people committed to fighting human trafficking and protecting the vulnerable. The peaceful routine of cattle and coffee remained, but it was now balanced by a larger purpose that gave new meaning to his life. Emma returned to her studies with renewed determination. Her traumatic experience transformed into motivation for a career in law enforcement. She carried with her the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to act in the face of evil, and in federal prisons across multiple states.